to the hottest paranormal life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe. Greetings, followers. It is I, Cardinal Sin, and today we have a very special guest on Into the Fringe, Mr. Micah Hanks. With more than a decade in podcasting, travel, writing, and research, and the study of history and science, Micah Hanks has more than just a passion for knowledge. His study of world history, culture, and philosophy over the years have helped shape his nonpartisan outlook on current events, and always with a nod to the lessons that history can teach us. Micah is a longtime advocate for scientific research into unidentified aerial phenomena, more commonly known as UFOs. He is a contributing member to the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, as well as a frequent commentator and writer on the subject, and maintains an interest in history and possible scientific explanations for aspects of the phenomenon. You can learn about some of Micah's UAP research at his website, micahhanks.com. His other interests include space studies, zoological mysteries, and unusual phenomena in nature. A hopeful skeptic, he advocates a critically minded approach to the study of these subjects. Be sure to visit Micah's blog for more of his research, writing, and ideas. In 2020, Micah launched The Debrief with journalists Tim McMillan and MJ Banias, a news site and media enterprise which examines science and disruptive technology. The Debrief has closely followed developments related to the United States government's collection and an evaluation of information related to UAP. After several years as a producer for iHeartMedia Company, Micah began podcasting in 2011. He has interviewed a number of fields of science, technology, philosophy, history, archaeology, and other disciplines. Micah is a frequent guest on podcasts and radio programs and has been interviewed by Vice, Forbes, Investigation Discovery, CNN Radio, Coast to Coast AM, Hot Air, and a number of other outlets. He has also lectured in America and Europe on a variety of subjects that include archaeology, unidentified flying objects, and historical mysteries. Welcome back, my friend Micah Hanks, to Into the Fringe.
Good to be here, Cardinal. I can't see you. Where did you go?
Oh, I'm here. My computer's just not cooperating with me. How have you been?
Well, the thing is, the computers, if they don't cooperate any better than this right now, just imagine once the AI takes over how things are going to be. That really scares me. But other than that,
I thought you were going to say that it must mean that Mercury is in retrograde.
Well, you know me too well, and you know my mystical inclinations. Then, no, actually, to the contrary. Lately in recent days, I was in Cape Girardeau giving a talk about the history of UAP up there at the wonderful Strange Tales 2022 conference, where we. The official name of, by the way, the Midwest Conference on the Unexplained or Unknown. And it was just a really great time. Michael Huntington put that on, along with the man behind really the entire effort, Ken Murphy, who is a conference guru up there in the Midwest. But this was his first event that kind of looked at these topics. And that was a lot of fun. And I'll just tell you, it was probably the most work I have put into a lecture. Really, believe it or not. I mean, it ended up being almost 2 hours long, and I take you from antiquity all the way up to the present day, stopping and doing analysis of famous UFO cases. Along the way, of course, we looked at the current developments with the Navy and the Pentagon. And then at the end of it, we did something a little different. I'm mostly known for the history side of things, but Cardinal, I will be happy to report here that we looked at the future, and we looked at the possible implications of UAP and everything from current efforts in science that may lead to more information about it, not just military efforts to try and get information about UAP. We also looked at the possible outcomes of things like a contact initiative, based on the presumption that there is a technology and that there are individuals or intelligences behind it. There's a lot of UFO data over the decades seems to suggest. We look at the idea of how one makes contact, or rather, how a civilization would potentially engage with that intelligence, and also just kind of weighing and assessing aspects of that related to, for instance, motives and intentions, and what looking at UAP incidents over the years can tell us about the motives or intentions of the operators. So it was an awful lot to try and cover. In that last portion, by the way, there's so much more that could be said about all those things than the time that we had in that 2-hour block allotted. But nonetheless, I think it was, for the most part, a success, and everybody had a good time. I know I did. And then, of course, we wrapped up the night, as you do on a Saturday night in Cape Girardeau, by going to an eldritch old mansion, the Glen House, and having cocktails. So my kind of night.
Cool. Is that a famous haunted mansion?
Reportedly, yeah. I mean, in my youth, when I was much more interested in kind of all aspects of the unexplained, I used to be as much into hauntings and ghosts and the like as the next guy. But I must admit, over the years, my attention has waned somewhat, and actually, if anything, it's really just focused more on the UAP topic. It's deep in rich history, trying to weigh the potentialities while also always being very skeptical about a lot of the extraordinary claims that really are rife throughout, especially ufology in the 20th century. And of course, then there's my love for the relic hominoid, Sasquatch. But again, apart from those two topics, which to me are fairly nuts and bolts, even though at times there is certainly room for I guess what my colleague Josh Cutchin, who was there at the event with us, would call a kind of a Magonian perspective on those topics, which he certainly has, whether it's ufology or whether it's Sasquatch or anything like that. He kind of looks at it through that Valayan lens of Passport to Magonia. But yeah, I definitely think that whether or not there are ghosts and whether or not the Glen house that we were at was haunted, it was a fun time, and I still enjoy old crumbly mansions where fine cocktails are served.
And I was going to say, evidently they have a liquor license.
Yeah. Well, at very least, fine dining, and I mean, it was just kind of like an after party thing after the event, but it was really a great time. And again, hats off to Ken Murphy and to Michael Huntington and the folks who put that on. Great time.
So, did you learn, Micah, finally, about the Cape Girardeau crash?
I did. Yes, I did indeed.
Did
and
they
actually,
hit you to that?
Well, in advance of going to the event, of course, I also kind of spent a little time looking into it, and I would put it right up there with all the other claims of crashes in the 20th century. My take on that, and again, I want to be very clear because I know I've talked about this in the past. I don't rule out the possibility that there have been valid crashes of exotic craft or what have you throughout time, at least on maybe one or two occasions. That possibility certainly exists. However, I am somewhat dubious of the idea, and I am especially skeptical of the notion that just throughout time, UFOs are just dropping out of the sky. I mean, they're just crashing one or two every decade, and somehow the military gets to all of them and gets them, before the civilian researchers can get a handle on what was happening. And that there's been such an effective effort at covering that up. And again, this is essentially, or at least a version of that, not to mischaracterize anybody's work. I actually really enjoyed the work of Leonard Stringfield, who used to do his status reports. But again, if you go back and you read those, as I have, and I've enjoyed the heck out of them, even though I don't really draw any of the same conclusions or believe that those are valid instances of crash wreckage retrievals. Those books, many of them, by the way, published, those status reports self-published by Stringfield in advance of the book by Berlitz and Moore in 1980, the Roswell incident, that really blew that whole thing open. Those status reports give us all kinds of, colorful tales. Many details in those stories very consistent with what became really kind of solidified around the Roswell narrative, beginning in 1980 and moving forward through up until at least the 1990s. Even today, in some circles, many still hold fast to Roswell as being the smoking gun.
Oh, sure.
I've talked about that a little bit, and about Kevin Randall even kind of backing off some of his insistence that it is this rock solid case. Although he still, as he'll tell you, maintains his bias comes down on an extraterrestrial craft of some kind crashing. But again, if we go back in time, we can at least, I've traced it at least back to maybe even actually the middle 19th century. But I mean, one of the more noticeable cases similar to Roswell, which I think we discussed briefly on the last show, maybe it was the 1886 Nebraska crash of a mystery meteor. 1897 Aurora, Texas, we have the crash of an airship and the purported charred remains of an occupant dragged out and buried there at the Aurora Cemetery, which I've been twice. And the funny thing is, I was giving this lecture over the weekend, and I mentioned that, and I said, I've been there twice, never found the little body. And a woman in the front row, she's a delightful woman who I've seen at a lot of the conferences, and her shtick, I guess, lovingly, is she sits on the front row and she tries to become a part of the lecture and talk with the person who's giving the talk. And yeah, I'm sure some folks out there may know who I'm talking about. But it's all fun. We talked a little after the talk as well. But at one point, she interjected. She said he was buried, but the gravestone was removed. And I said, I know. I've heard the legend. And in fact, actually, Jim Mars provided me with a copy of the alleged marker that once had a sort of flying saucer-like image that was sort of scored onto that stone. He showed it to me, and I was able to take a photo of the photo, the original photo that Jim Mars had before he died. But again, my estimation of that case is that it's probably no different from any of those other alleged airship or saucer crashes. It was just another story, probably. But we went out to the crash site where the windmill stood that the thing allegedly struck. When it comes to Cape Girardeau, this one's maybe the most significant for having allegedly occurred in 1941. So it's actually a good 6 years before the Roswell incident, thereabouts, I guess, depending on
Or
which.
even Kenneth Arnold.
Yeah. I mean, it was the main point is that it was actually in advance of the most significant reports of World War II UFO sightings. And there were actually a lot of them right here, even in the United States. Jerry Casey, who was the famous flight instructor out in California in 1943, he was doing a flight with a student, and he encountered, again, what he drew was almost a classic flying saucer that he said kind of wobbled as it took off at tremendous speed. At the time, 1943, he didn't report it because Casey had thought this might be some sort of new experimental aircraft that was being built to aid in the war effort. And he knew that loose lips sink ships, so he didn't talk about it.
And that's exactly what Kenneth Arnold said. He figured it was one of those newfangled jets they'd been talking about.
Yeah. And so a lot of UFO sightings, I think, during the war weren't reported. And then the other side of that is that there were a lot of reports that actually were collected of strange things that were seen in the skies, especially up along the northeastern coast, because there were active watches looking for any kind of aircraft that weren't supposed to be there, for fear of there being reconnaissance, or even worse, a potential attack, as unlikely as that potential might be. But I mean, we were at war. We didn't want to take any chances, and look at what had just happened at Pearl Harbor. So Barry Greenwood has actually harvested some really good reports from that era of, maybe not classic saucers. In some instances, they certainly sound like that, but in other instances, they were just kind of unusual flying objects that were seen. The long story short, the Cape Girardeau crash that occurred in 1941, yet again, seems to have all those kind of hallmarks of the crash wreckage retrieval legend. Michael talked about that a little bit on Sunday during his talk, and I'd put it right there in that burgeoning kind of mythos that over the 20th century surrounded stories of UFOs. That crash wreckage idea seemed to go much further back even than the modern UFO era.
Yeah, it always surprises me. I had a very similar sort of background as you did. I read every book I could get my hands on when I was a very young kid about all aspects of the paranormal, psychic phenomena and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, and you name it, I was into it. And over the years, I've kind of shrugged off everything except maybe UAP and Bigfoot, and maybe I still have one or two hanging around, but so to speak. But what were some of the takeaways for you from that conference that you found surprising in the sense that you hadn't sort of been hipped to them before?
Well, you know, the lecture by my pal Josh Cutchin was extremely interesting because he's got this new, very interesting 2 volume, but then there's actually a third volume that is an appendix.
Oh, are they doing
Uh,
a third one?
well, it's a third volume that is no. This isn't what you're probably thinking. This isn't Where the Footprints End. This is his very latest project. It's a solo effort called Ecology of Souls,
Mm,
and this is looking at essentially parallels between death and the UFO phenomenon.
yes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, and as is always the case with Josh's works, very scholarly analysis of the parallels. And a lot of people might say, okay, you know, I don't see these connections that you're talking about, especially if you're a nuts and bolts UFO thinker, which interestingly, over the years, I have kind of become more and more that myself, while acknowledging that there are aspects of the UFO mystery that obviously involve the human mind and perception. And it really, for me, as far as those more esoteric things, it just involves the difference between is that actually what the phenomena is and what it is doing, or are those the ways that humans, through the sort of time honored religious or mystical experience, how we perceive things. And again, I'll just point out David Halperin and many other researchers note the unambiguous, frankly, the obvious connections between religious experiences throughout time and modern UFO experiences. Now, where I would differ with dear Dr. Halperin, who I respect immensely and we keep in touch periodically, I would differ on the idea that modern UFO sightings, all of them essentially, can be explained as religious experiences. But
Yeah.
I do think that some modern UFO sightings are probably mundane things that a human has seen and has ascribed agency to, and they thereby interpret them in almost religious terms. We would say, if we go back in time, centuries, that, the religious experience is how that manifested. Today, through our technological lens of seeing things, people go, oh my gosh, and the light in the sky was a clear sign of extraterrestrials, and they loved me, and they want to try and protect humankind. I mean, you hear these kinds of things that have these religious overtones. So that's not very far from where Joshua lands with Ecology of Souls and looking at the because again, if we look at death, I mean, that in itself is very much a question that theologians have attempted to address over time. Is bodily death the end? Does consciousness persist?
Hmm.
Those, by the way, as far as Fortiana goes, or just in terms of consciousness and science, I mean, those are still very relevant and interesting questions for me. But Josh takes a very interesting, truly unique approach too, I think, in looking at that. So he gave his lecture about that, but it's a 2 volume set plus a sources compendium, which he makes available in print so that if you want the entire thing, you can have it. But that third volume, it's in its entirety available on his website, so you can go and you can get that there and just
So
buy.
is
Yeah,
his set of these two books out?
I believe they are. Yeah, I mean, I
Oh
have two
gosh.
copies of them.
Uh,
Yeah.
I've been emailing him trying to get him back on the show. Maybe
Uh huh.
he was just so busy he couldn't reply, but
He's been tremendously busy,
now
and
I've got
so
a good reason to harp on him and get him to come back on, talk
yeah, you
about this,
should.
because this is a subject that, several, I guess you'd say, ufologists or authors have discussed the commonalities between the UFO experience and death. Whitley Strieber among them, you know.
Well, and again, I should just qualify that earlier statement I made that Josh's analysis is entirely unique. I don't know of any other book that really so deeply, from again, what I would call a primarily Vallée-inspired Magonian kind of perspective,
Hmm.
analyzes the connections potentially between the UFO and UFO lore and death. But as you correctly point out, not only Whitley Strieber, but maybe more importantly, his late wife, Anne Strieber, had been not only proponents of that idea, and Anne had, I mean, she had flatly said that, Whitley, this has something to do with our dead. And she had lots and lots of correspondences from people over the years who had said that during abduction experiences, they would see deceased loved ones and things
Yeah,
like this, right?
yeah.
Now, Anne's correspondence and what have you, I don't think that Josh had access to the full thing. And I mean, keeping in mind that this book is already 2 volumes plus this additional compendium.
Boy, Josh sure does like to write, doesn't he?
Well, he does. And again, he's blessed enough to be able to have an arrangement where his wife is forgiving of him wanting to take time for a few months at a time to write a book. I being a solo agent, I guess, for the most part, it's more difficult for me to find that time because, I'm relying on myself for income. And so income and other priorities always take precedence. I wish I had the kind of stamina and also the kind of schedule to facilitate the kind of writing that Josh does, because it's just incredible. But long story short, again, the book covers a lot of these areas, and you're right, it does have a bit to do and was actually inspired by the Strebers and some of those observations. Definitely thought-provoking. I don't think that the nuts and bolts UFO guy or girl is going to enjoy that book necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I'm one of these people who, despite my own perspective on these topics, I enjoy either a thought experiment or something that intellectually challenges what I think I know, or just plain and simple, something that's just a fun read. And I've always enjoyed Josh's books for all of the above.
Yeah, he's a great writer. He's a great speaker. We've had him on Into the Fringe a couple of times. He's just so instantly likable a guy, and really, as you said, knowledgeable and yeah, it's fun to play around in his sandbox.
I don't recall how many more episodes you and I have in this 6 months stint that we've been doing here, but if you recall how Boz joined us on the first one of mine, maybe, and that would be a cool tradition. I don't know. You do your show how you want to do, Card. It's all up to you. But just how I came on and it overlapped with Bosley, it would be cool if my series ended with an overlap having Kutch and I on together.
I would love to have the two of you on. That'd be great.
Because apart from just our Fortiana interests, we're also both musicians, and we have a lot in common outside of Fortiana, and just frankly enjoy hanging out. He and Ryan Sprague and I had a good old time up there this weekend, and it was just great to see Josh finally after so many years, because he lives really close to me. Maybe 2.5 hours, but we very rarely, especially since COVID, have been able to make the trip. So any opportunity to chat, that could be a fun thing. Just putting it out there.
Well, I'm a professional musician myself, and I'm a drummer, so we could actually jam.
I don't know that you've ever told me that.
Yeah.
Really?
And Josh never mentioned to me that he was a professional musician, but now I know. So now we'll have to schedule some studio time.
Well, we certainly will. Yeah. If I'd known that you were a drummer, of course, I'm a guitar player primarily. And Josh, he'll fit right in there on the tuba, which is his instrument. And let me tell you, to be a both classically trained but also a jazz improvisational tubaist, he gets called, basically, he is the go-to tubaist in the Atlanta area, basically. So, yeah. That's part of his livelihood. And that's cool. It's an instrument that you don't see all that many people. You do, depending on what kinds of genres you follow, but that's kind of what he does. Yeah.
Yeah. Growing up in the punk rock tradition, if you can, if those two things are oxymoronic, I've seen a lot of my old compatriots turn to bluegrass, and I found myself once back in the day being asked to join a fairly notable jazz musician here from Lawrence and his son on the drums, having had no jazz training at all. And I found that I fit in with the jazz improv thing quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think especially with I guess with percussion, that would really make sense as a melodic instrument. Trying to do guitar in that context is a little more difficult. My father, by the way, is a just excellent guitarist and really multi-instrumentalist, plays all these instruments. I play a couple of other instruments, but I don't really claim them. I had 6 years of classical training on violin, and then I tried to learn Irish.
I played violin for 7 years.
Did you really? Yeah. See, I really enjoy classical music, but again, I kind of got to a point, and listen, this is no different from like being a multi-anomalist, and I'm still like that. Multi-anomalist,
I like that.
Well, I mean, again, rather than the kinds of, like paranormal stuff, ghosts and everything that a lot of people follow, my anomalistic pursuits involve things like lightning super bolts. I'm really fascinated by the mystery booms. And, some folks out there who followed me for a while may know mysterybooms.com is actually a website I've maintained for years that is kind of like an online one-stop shop for all information related to mystery booms. I used to try and keep it up to date with news and things, and now it's more of a resource page that offers a lot of different data. But I love those kind of little internet archaeology gems. A lot of them no longer online, and that's why I say internet archaeology. If you go on Wayback Machine and you know the URLs, you can sometimes dig up some cool old websites that no longer exist. And then there are those websites that are still online, but I mean, they look like they were built in like 1991,
Right.
and they're just very, very basic. But man, those have the best data about UFOs. And again, just my favorites are the incredible website that Fran Ridge has kept up online, NICAP.org, I believe. I believe it's a .org. And actually, you know what? I'm just going to check that really quickly while we're talking so I can make sure I give out the right. Yeah, it is NICAP.org. But Fran has maintained that website not only is just a location for a large amount of the old NICAP data, but I mean, there's a lot of other information available there too. I mean, a lot of classic books that are now in the public domain about this subject that nobody even knows about, but that everybody should read. You can read a lot of those in PDF or HTML format there on the website. There are a lot of case files and reports and things. Yeah, I mean, it's just an excellent site. So really, it's one of my go-to favorite UFO sites. And then you've got some other really interesting ones. I mean, out there that, let me just put it this way. I mean, almost all of the most important information about the history of the UFO subject, nearly all, if not all of it, that's available to the public is actually freely available online, but most people just don't know where to look. And so that's part of the effort I try to do. I always point people over to the Science Oral History Project. Speaking of mystery booms, there was a loud explosion here. So if my internet goes out, yeah, just heard an extremely loud explosion. I don't know if that came across the microphone, but
No, it didn't. But hopefully you'll stay on.
we may have just experienced a mystery boom right here and now. I'll keep you updated.
Okay.
If I hear another one, that was an extraordinarily loud, almost like a sonic boom. But
I lost power here the other day after an enormously strong electrical storm rolled through Lawrence, and the whole area, as I found out later, and it was so severe it knocked out my cable modem, and I had to switch it out at my ISP, which has nothing to do with my video issues or browser issues or whatever they are. But yeah, when I woke up and went downstairs, I looked outside and saw these guys across the street putting in a new transformer. So
yeah,
we'd had a lightning strike that was very close.
yeah, they can definitely happen. Now that didn't sound like a lightning strike, and there isn't a storm front here. But on that subject, I was actually corresponding with J.F. Ripoll, who is a French researcher who is kind of one of the best experts out there on these superbolt lightning strikes. And again, this is another instance of, I think I mentioned that actually immediately before mystery booms, but the connection here is that mystery booms have been associated with superbolt lightning strikes, like in the case of the infamous Bell Island boom back in the 1970s. And we first, I think, really began to detect the fact that there are anomalously powerful lightning strikes that occur, far more energetic than average lightning, with the help of the Vela satellites that were put in orbit to help us detect possible signatures from nuclear explosions. The Soviets would have been, detonations that occurred during Soviet nuke tests back in the Cold War.
Right.
And we started detecting what were obviously, especially over bodies of water, even like the ocean, so we knew that they weren't nuke tests, hoped that they weren't. And again, it was evident that these were very powerful lightning strikes. And so this so-called superbolt phenomenon became something that we became conscious of. So again, that would be a good example back to the discussion from earlier of the kinds of anomalies that I'm really interested in and following these days, which I don't think are as entertaining to the average paranormalist. I get it. That's really dry for them. But for scientists, and this is the important thing, I try to approach ufology in the same manner. Look, let's not ignore the history. Look at the claims of the abductees. Look at the stories, of sightings of the craft. Don't rule anything out, but always be skeptical.
Sure.
Make sure that you don't just say, this doesn't sound legitimate, therefore I'm not going to pay any attention to it. Give some credence to the idea that if you rule out any possibility at the outset without proper investigation, you may potentially miss data. And so, mysteries of science fascinate me. And if we treat UFOs or UAP like that, a mystery of science that we, again, however incredible some of the data that were presented may seem, we analyze all of it and we try to give it a fair shake so that we don't miss anything potentially. That's, to me, how we're going to resolve this phenomenon. And, on Twitter today, there was a thread going on where people were commenting on the fact that I'd, done a brief segment on the podcast recently talking about Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who is leading the effort with the new all-domain anomaly resolution office that the DoD is the same thing as the AIMSOG. They've just given it a new name. But, again, Dr. Kirkpatrick definitely seems to kind of turn his back to previous efforts because of certain stigmas that have become associated with that, i.e. Skinwalker Ranch and some things we're going to talk about tonight.
Mm-hmm.
But I really respect, first of all, Dr. Kirkpatrick's credentials. He's got amazing credentials. As far as a person in government who has the kind of street cred to be able to really, carry out a serious systematic effort to study UAP, I couldn't imagine anybody more qualified or better suited. And as an educator, in Georgia, Alabama, I guess. I think he resides in Huntsville, although he may have relocated to Washington, D.C. in recent days based on information I'm gleaning. I think he's just very well equipped to study this phenomenon. And I think that his involvement, pending any discoveries by the Arrow, if we're to call it that, in the days ahead, this is going to be the blue book of our generation. Except I hope it's not going to be this public relations exercise.
Yeah.
Right. I actually hope, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see, but I think with somebody, again, not just an Air Force officer who's taking phone calls at a desk, right? Patterson Air Force Base, this is Project Blue Book. No, Dr. Kirkpatrick and his team, I hope that they're going to be really, really, really well equipped and seriously minded in the scientific approach to trying to study UAP, and that maybe it may be decades before we get all the data, or at least more significant portions than what you and I may see in the next decade or so. But if and when information about the efforts of Arrow and other components within government come out, this could be what moves our understanding of this phenomenon forward. This paired with the efforts of civilian scientists. So anyway, I think my monologue should end right there, and I should let you ask a question. But that just underscores how much has been going on in recent days. We always have plenty to talk about.
Yeah. I did want to mention here that we are going to be giving away an autographed copy of your book, The Ghost Rockets. So stick around in the chat. You must be chat present to be chat eligible to win. So we'll be doing that toward the end of our show. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on to some of the topics that you mentioned last time that you wanted to discuss. I remember that you had brought up the Friendship Island case, otherwise known as the South American Area 51.
Well, yeah, and this is a case that, really doesn't get very much attention, at least in the United States. And over the years, I've spoken to a lot of people about the idea, and really where this goes. This takes us back to the conversation with Boz. Again, I refer to him affectionately as Boz.
Boz, yeah.
But for those out there who don't know who Gil and I are talking about, I'm referring to Walter Bosley. And Walter and I would call Walter, I think he would call himself this too, to an extent. He's sort of a speculative historian. It's not historical fiction by any stretch of the imagination. He's writing about real history, but what he does is, unlike a historian who takes, hard facts, dates, places, primary source documents, etc., he does this kind of investigative, like detective work with history, where he speculates on what's in between the lines between the sources and the gaps between sources, right? And of course, some would say that maybe he, his imagination runs wild. Others, again, and there've been some very credible researchers who have looked at Bosley's work and just said, wow, this guy is just, he just pretty closely ties it together without being able to provide, again, what a historian would use, which is a primary source that documents the claim. It seems pretty evident to me that there's a hidden dimension of the history of aerospace developments and what have you, and a lot of Walter's work, kind of strikes at that point. So, and one reason I've always enjoyed it and appreciate what Bosley does in his approaches. So that said, the idea of a breakaway civilization is a natural kind of an outgrowth. One of the researchers, by the way, I'll mention, who's really praised Walter's work is Joseph P. Farrell, who is often written about Walter's, speculative history and his approaches in his books, and one of the running themes, I guess, between both of Bosley's and Farrell's works involves this notion that there could be some sort of a breakaway civilization, and in whatever capacity that could possibly exist. It's a speculation. I think that the expression breakaway civilization was first coined by Richard Dolan, but the premise, again, is just that there's potentially some component that has the kind of funding mechanisms necessary to facilitate the kind of technological developments that allows an outgrowth of technology as what we would effectively term a NGO, right? A non-governmental organization or entity. And that this is perhaps one explanation, one mechanism for explaining UAP sightings and other kinds of mysteries over time. Now, a lot of people, and this is interesting to me, express a lot of skepticism about that. And they say, there's no way that an entity outside of a government could ever have enough resources, enough funding to be able to facilitate something like that. So this is a nonsensical claim. To which I would simply offer as a counterpoint, for those who are not proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis behind UFOs, which is a more likely, even if they aren't a provable hypothesis, which is the most likely of these two? Extraterrestrial visitation underlying claims of UFO sightings, or if we exclude the notion that they're always just cranks and weirdos seeing these things, or people making up stories and misperceptions, hoaxes, delusions, all this stuff that the skeptic tends to gravitate toward, if not ET, the other possibility I would put forward is, again, some sort of an earthly component that somehow has remained behind the scenes. Now, that could occur actually in a lot of ways. It may be this idea of the breakaway civilization that is something extra governmental. Many would say that actually more likely it sounds like it's probably something that resulted from, black programs, special access programs and things like that that operate in such a compartmentalized way. But a fundamental component is that they are government funded, but that they're kept off the books. And even people in the highest echelons of our military are largely, if not entirely, unaware of the existence of such programs. Bottom line is, there are a variety of ways that we could rationalize the notion that there's some sort of a secret component with the proper funding, and funding that could facilitate technological developments that would allow for aerospace developments beyond the known, history of aviation and what have you. Now, that said, I've always kept that thought in mind and have been very interested in that and the speculations of, guys like Bosley and Farrell and Dolan and others. But again, taking my own kind of more skeptical kind of historical approach to it. And this really interesting story begins to kind of emerge back beginning in the 1980s out of Chile, which involves a variety of different encounters that people were having with these individuals down there. To present the facts kind of quickly, and just to hit the key points, one of the earliest stories was told by a guy, I believe by the name of Ernesto de la Fuente, who had fallen ill, and he had claimed that he was visited by these guys who he'd done some work for, who worked out on this island out there. And they all use classical names like, Raphael and, Michelangelo and things like this. And they'd come to him and they'd said, listen, you helped us, and so we'll help you. I think he had been stricken with cancer, and he was reportedly healed of his illness. We also had the account of a guy named Octavio Ortiz, who claimed that he was contacted via his shortwave radio on his sailing vessel. He was a sailor, and that he was basically contracted to bring some, supplies and things periodically out to this unusual island out there around the vicinity of Chiloé Island, which is located on the western side of Chile in this little chain of islands. Now, those two stories may not sound like they have much to do with UFOs, but the interesting thing is that both De La Fuente and also this Ortiz character both kind of maintain that, especially in Ortiz's case, when he would receive these communications from the folks who called themselves the Friendship, and that their place of residence was thereby effectively a Friendship Island, that these lights would appear in the sky, often accompanying the communications and things like this. Um, the story kind of reached critical mass around 1986, and then there was purportedly a sighting of one of their craft over Santiago, and this was widely publicized. But there was and I think it was probably a correct uh, article that appeared in the Magonia magazine that basically was saying that the thing that was seen over Santiago was obviously an atmospheric balloon. It was known, it was tracked and traced, and it was indisputably debunked, and that had nothing to do with any kind of aircraft belonging to the Holy Brethren out there at Friendship Island. And the Magonia article essentially concluded, and therefore, there's really nothing to see here. There's no story to the Friendship case. Now, where things began to get really interesting for me was that I believe it was on the blog Inexplicata, the Latin American UAP blog that's been maintained by Scott Corrales for many years, veteran researcher of many years involved with the South American UFO component and other aspects of the UFO mystery. And also, in truth, if you do foreign language searches, I'll often, I mean, having spent some time in Brazil, of course, I began learning Brazilian Portuguese, but I also speak just a modicum of Spanish. And with translation software, even if you don't speak languages, you can translate things. So, I mean, I've spent a lot of time on language, ufological blogs and websites in languages that I'm not particularly fluent in, especially Spanish, Portuguese, etc. And on a lot of the South American UFO blogs, you'll find more information about the Friendship case. It's fascinating because you'll see that language and other things culturally are barriers often. I've seen the UFO skeptic Nick West note in recent days that UFOs are a culture-bound phenomenon when he looks at data sets that appear to show, and he put up like an image of like a map somebody had made of big UFO sightings over the last whatever period in history, and most of them are over the United States. And I'm saying, well, before we say this is a culture-bound phenomena, shouldn't we ask, what were the data sets that the map maker used? What were that person's biases? Is it really true that UAP are only seen in the United States, or that they mostly are seen in the United States? Again, go ask a Brazilian that. I've done that.
Right.
Travel to Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America. Ask them. I've done that. Now, again, not to entirely derail the conversation, the point is I've spent time on Latin American UFO blogs and found a lot more information that American researchers who are primarily English speakers simply either don't know of or don't go looking for.
Sure.
And you start finding some interesting things. A few of the examples, there was an excellent post that Scott Corrales put up where he had basically kind of collected a lot of accounts that had been sent to him by researchers, which he translates, and of course, being multilingual, he provides in English, which is a tremendous resource for a researcher like me. And the variety of opinions expressed by Latin American UFO researchers were really, really, really thought-provoking to me. Some had said that, best we can tell, the Friendship Island case did involve people on an island. There was some kind of a technology. They were highly advanced. People who had traveled to the island talked about the advancement of their technology, and it was essentially like an Area 51, but down there in South America. Well, another conjecture that had been raised involved the idea that toward the end of the Second World War, there had essentially been a purchase, and that an island that Germany had acquired later was basically repurposed, and that the people there around Chiloé knew of this island, and that there were people there, gringos, many of them blonde-haired, blue eyes. Some of them spoke German, some of them spoke American, right? English. Now that really intrigues us if we think about the Operation Paperclip scenario, where German scientists at the end of the Second World War were brought to America, and some of the stories associated with Friendship Island involved, both English and German speakers who lived on this island and worked with this advanced technology. There were also a lot of stories involving the traditional belief in a ghost ship down there around Chiloé Island called El Caliuche. But the way that Caliuche or El Caliuche fits into all of this is interesting because there were a lot of fishermen who out there around Chiloé Island would come out saying, "We've seen El Caliuche." Yeah, it's like a boat. It's got a lot of lights on it, but it flies over the water. It doesn't sail on the water. It flies over it like a ghost ship, but it has all these lights. And again, the way that they would describe it, they described it as a boat, but with all these lights. And there were certain aspects, obviously, of technology that seemed to describe almost like some sort of a hovercraft or something. There were also the sightings there at the main port at Puerto Montt, the nearest town, I guess, where people would say that the Holy Brothers would sometimes show up. They would pay for things with, for instance, rare metals and what have you. They always arrived on a boat that was called the Mytilus II. And this is perhaps most intriguingly, there was a Latin American sociologist who did an investigation and spoke to people who had purportedly met the Holy Brothers, and they had essentially told him that in addition to paying with regular currency or sometimes with rare metals, and they would buy things like sick cattle, and these kinds of unusual things, that from time to time that they would actually pay with a check, and on one occasion that they had presented a check as a form of payment, hoping to be able to purchase supplies, and the check was from like the Mine Science Foundation. Now, for those who aren't familiar with that, this is very interesting. It was a research and development, an R&D. Um, I guess you would call it a facility or organization. That was I think founded around 1947 by none other than Tom Slick. Tom Slick, of course, being the guy who was the American oil tycoon and philanthropist, who also funded Peter Burns' Yeti and then his subsequent American search for Sasquatch in the early 1960s before he was tragically killed in a airplane accident. And there have been a lot of folks, Lauren Coleman among them, who have argued over the years that Slick seemed to have CIA connections. And interestingly, I was able to actually confirm that that is true to an extent through CIA documents that were later released, which I found on their website. I'd never heard anybody talk about them, but the CIA periodically releases documentation like a lot of agencies. And lo and behold, I was doing a search on their website, and I did find one search relevant to Tom Slick, where they talked about having met Slick and that Slick had spoken with CIA agents on a few occasions, but that primarily it was with the interest in trying to get them involved with or interested in his schemes, various things. He was trying to look for funding and things. So they said, at no time does the CIA know of any employment history that he's had with our agency. They state that in the documents. So
Right.
it does seem that he'd been in touch with the CIA but hadn't worked for them. But this organization, the Mine Science Foundation, was supposedly connected with some payment mechanism that was showing up down there in South America in association with the Holy Brothers, who would arrive in the Mytilus II and show up there at Puerto Montt and try to buy supplies. So all of that said, there was this unusual component that seemed to involve advanced technology, these mysterious individuals, a German and an American component, tying back to an R&D foundation that dated back to the 1940s and had connections with Tom Slick. I mean, it's truly bizarre stuff. But one of the most compelling things probably that I've uncovered in recent years was there was a blog. And again, this is a completely Spanish language blog, so most American researchers, if any, are probably unaware of this. But there had been an English language advertisement placed in a Puerto Montt newspaper, I think sometime in the early 2000s. I've still got screen grabs about this in my files. An advertisement in English language that appeared in this Puerto Montt Spanish language newspaper read, "To Friendship Island." And I'm paraphrasing here, but it said, "I am the mechanical engineer in Sarasota, Florida, who you visited a few years ago. I was frightened when you came to my home because I did not know who you were. Now I know who you are, and I want to visit your home. Please contact me. You still have my contact information." And I'm like, okay,
Wow.
yeah. Now, that's either like a bizarre hoax that they did, they being, who knows, somebody who follows the story and decided to, in a Spanish language publication, spend the money to publish an English ad that ran for a few weeks. But again, it's just a truly bizarre.
Nobody would have any reason or or need to hoax something like that.
You know, Cardinal, here's the thing. I don't ever underestimate people's desire to carry out a hoax, and that's the thing. You look at MJ12. You look at the meticulousness that people try to apply to a hoax like that. So I don't rule anything out. But
Sure.
again, I look at that and I have to imagine that it's a truly bizarre story. And I mean, if that advertisement was any indication of real events, that would seem to indicate a few things. Today, the Friendship Islanders get around. They make visits to North America and have visited people. Why they were
And
interested in
that they
this,
read this particular newspaper.
they might. But if they don't, this mechanical engineer knew about them and who they were, roughly the geographical area where they might be found, and he published an ad in that newspaper hoping that they would come see him. But again, another interesting clue here is they were traveling to visit with a mechanical engineer, presumably wanting to ask for him to why had they visited him. I mean, again, there's so much left to speculation here.
Yeah.
But for my own part, the accumulation of all these accounts from different individuals, researchers, and people over the years seems to indicate that there was something down there. And again, I've heard researchers refer to it. One researcher in particular had said the best estimation we have is that it was like a Latin America version of Area 51. That there was some kind of a project that was going on out there on an island, maybe German scientists and Americans working together. And at least as recently as maybe, if that advertisement is true and accurate, the 2000s, but certainly going back to the 1980s. Now, another brief, interesting addendum to all this is that when I first talked about this on my program, it was during a conversation I was having with Walter Bosley the first time he was on my show, right? And shortly after I had Bosley on the show and I brought this up and asked him if he'd ever heard anything about all of this, I flew to England and I was going to go over there and I was going to give a talk, of all things, about Friendship Island in Leeds. And lo and behold, I'm sitting in the airport over there in, I guess I was actually in Holland, I think. I think I was in, I was in Holland during a layover and then headed back to England. And there in Holland, I'm checking my emails and I have a message from a Mr. Peter Lavenda who says, listen to your show. I'd never talked with Peter before, but he reached out and he says, I heard your show. A colleague brought it to my attention that you were talking about this interesting thing in South America. This sounds really interesting to some experiences I had down there. And so immediately after returning from England, Peter came on my program and we had a conversation. And again, for those who have read his book Unholy Alliance, and again, my fascination with history has also taken me into an interest in what Peter covers in that book, which is essentially the occult interests of the Nazis. I recently actually narrated an audiobook for Professor Ronald Flowers, which the audiobook isn't out yet, but the book is already available if people want to read it. Very lengthy, very, very in-depth historical analysis, but it's called The Occult in National Socialism. And Dr. Flowers, being an occult historian, provides one of the most in-depth analyses that's ever been written. I happen to know that because I narrated the damn thing.
Right.
But again, he covers some of the speculations about, Wunderwaffen, the wondercraft and things, wonder weapons, rather. He talks about UFO speculations and things in that book, and largely dismisses most of it, from a scholarly perspective, which is respectable in my view. But I bring that up because in Lavenda's book, which came out many decades before Unholy Alliance, it essentially was one of the earlier books to provide this perspective on the Nazis and their occult interests. But at the beginning and the end of the book, Lavenda's talking about traveling down there to Chile during the years of the Pinochet regime and going up to this place called Colonia Dignidad. And Colonia Dignidad was run by a guy named Paul Schaefer, and I don't mean the pianist, on late night television. This was a escaped Nazi who was basically in league with the Pinochet regime. And Lavenda, God, couldn't have been, but in his early 20s, went down there, traveled to Colonia Dignidad, got out of the car, took photographs, was, immediately detained. And he was lucky that he got out alive and was essentially ordered to go back to the United States. His flights and passage were booked. And then he was interrogated when he got back to Miami. And it really kind of startled him because he's like, not only did I go all the way to Chile, basically as an investigative reporter to try and get information about what's going on down there at this location. But I get my ass sent right back to the United States, and I get basically debriefed when I arrive back in Miami International. And he says that it seemed to indicate to me that whatever was going on down there in Chile had like an arm that extended all the way back to the United States. And he said, yeah, certain aspects of this weird friendship thing you're talking about do remind me a little of what I experienced while I was down there. So
Interesting.
yeah, so that in a nutshell is the Friendship Island thing. Which again, if I had to, over the years, I've looked at it less and less as a UFO thing, but I see it as probably some kind of a interesting. How would we phrase this? I mean, it's like a, I don't know if it's government. I would imagine it may be government, extra governmental, possibly, but I mean, whatever it is, it's some sort of an effort that involves advanced technology. But like a lot of those kinds of things, including our own black projects here in the United States, the convenient use of UFOs as a cover for their actual innovations and developments would not, to me, seem out of the ballpark in terms of what's really going on, rather than having an actual UFO component. But the other, more speculative side of that would be that there is a UFO component, and it doesn't have to do with aliens visiting Earth. It's this notion of a breakaway component where there's some kind of a secret technological development, and hence my interest in that led me kind of to go down that rabbit hole in search of answers regarding Friendship Island. And again, it amazes me that with its at least even tangent connection to the UFO subject, that there aren't more American researchers who really look at that, and hence the wonderful pleasure of the opportunity to talk with you about it tonight, Cardinal.
Why, thank you. Something that's also kind of interesting. The Boz has taken to calling them breakaway societies rather
Right.
than civilizations, and that I think one of the ways that he thinks that this whole thing may have come about is that we may be putting the wrong shoe on the other foot, as it were. That these breakaway civilizations or societies may come from a part in the distant past where, because of some sort of cataclysm or what have you, that this is another branch of the human species, of the human family, that because it had higher technology than we can know, because everything has been, moved and shaped as far as topology is concerned, that there just may be no record of that civilization, whether it was Atlantis sinking into the waves or what have you, that, it may be a sort of an antediluvian breakaway civilization. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, I've entertained all possibilities. Um, do the legends, and again, a great book, by the way, on the whole Atlantis thing, I guess, is called Lost Continents by L. Sprague de Camp, which in that book he examines not just Atlantis, but skeptically. By the way, he was an art skeptic in his day,
Oh yeah.
but de Camp, examines the lost continent motif, right? And it's an interesting read because in reading books like that myself, I've wondered about, instead of there being, and much like the camp would argue, instead of there being one actual lost civilization, that there's this mythos that kind of involves them, much like the so-called myth of the flying saucer crash wreckage retrieval, or what I like to call crash wreckage syndrome, right? Um, I've wondered on the other side of that debate, because it's obvious that there wasn't just a single sunken continent, and there's this whole mythos surrounding it. Does it nonetheless maybe point back to the idea of there being a kind of cultural memory, a tradition that has taken many shapes over time, but which all seem to point back to a singular occurrence that actually did have some relevance, and maybe it's been mythologized, like a lot of things end up being. Again, a great example, and this is the one that I guess the pseudo historians sort of always point to. They always say, look at Troy. Troy was believed to have been a mythical city. And it was later, of course, proven to exist by a amateur archaeologist, although archaeology was probably in its infancy, if actually not embryonic at the point. But Heinrich
Hmm.
Schliemann, he actually dug down through the strata where Troy actually existed, but he nonetheless got the location right. Through his reading of historical resources, he was able to pinpoint the location he thought it was. He excavated, and he effectively, although he missed it and dug a little too deep, he nonetheless found the location of Troy. There are a lot of similar discoveries that were once thought to be myth, and what we find actually is that they were real places, but that they were mythologized.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if, even if it wasn't in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, if there wasn't some element of truth to the idea, the myth that we would call Atlantis, or we might call that any number of other things. Ultima Thule, we might call that Hyperborea, we might call that, again, on the more fringe side of things, Lemuria, we might call that the Aztlan, of the
Sure.
Mesoamericans who talked about this island that they all came from. Again, the point is there are a lot of different cultural traditions involving a lost land or some sort of a place you could go to. So yeah, I've entertained that idea. Could there have been an intelligence that came from, or a civilization, an offshoot of an early form of civilization? Maybe, again, to effectively appropriate Boz's terminology, a breakaway society rather than a civilization, right?
Hmm.
I've definitely wondered about that. Which brings us to Betty and Barney Hill.
Of course.
Yes. Now, a lot of folks would probably say, what does Betty and Barney Hill have to do with all this? But I mean, in recent days, I've been doing a deep dive into Betty and Barney Hill, both in preparation for a writing project that I've been working on, and then also just, the request of my listeners. Several of my listeners have. I'm known for taking a historical UFO case and doing a deep dive where I really, really, really broaden the narrative and don't just retell the story, but I look at, the facts, look at the primary sources, almost like what Dan Carlin does, right, with Hardcore History. I try to do with a UFO case every now and then on
Right.
my show, and do less news and more narrative. Anyway, my listeners have always said, there's no case that deserves that, and frankly, may need it more than Betty and Barney Hill. Why don't you do that? Because unlike a lot of researchers or podcasters or what have you, you pay equal credence and attention to the skeptical perspectives on things, which I always try to do to maintain balance. Now, we're going to do that right now in very short form with Betty and Barney Hill.
Okay.
The facts of the case, right? Between September 19th and 20th, 1961, the Hills are returning from their belated honeymoon up there to Montreal and Niagara Falls. They're coming back home along Route 3, headed south back to their home in New Hampshire. And as it happens, Betty is the first, since Barney's driving. He sees this light, or she sees this light, I'm sorry, which was a little below and to the left of the moon, I believe, but above the planet Jupiter. And she sees this thing come up, and she first sees it moving upward and thinks it's a shooting star, but somehow it was at an angle that she sees it moving upward. But then it passes in front of the moon and keeps traveling. And for, several minutes, they continue to see this thing. The Hills stop the car several times and stop to observe it. They let their little dog, her little dachshund, out of the car to go do its business and everything, while they're both looking at it through the binoculars. Now, Betty's obviously very interested. Barney's convinced it's either a helicopter or a plane. But as they're coming along, they notice that this aircraft at one point just kind of does a strange turn and comes and starts moving directly in their direction. So eventually they get on down the road, and pass a landmark that's known as the Old Man of the Mountain, which, it's a rock face that resembles a man's profile and everything. And it comes out from behind the mountain. It's now just, based on Betty's estimate, maybe a few 100 feet in the air. And it's coming on down toward them. And they go on up the road and everything, and they stop. And Barney, with the engine still running, gets his pistol, puts it in his pocket, carries the binocular, and he walks out into the field to get a close look at this aircraft, which at this point, at very least, according to the Hills, there was like a band of light that was visible on it, which pretty quickly became evidently a double row of windows. Now, this is the classic narrative, and this is what we need to pay very close attention to. Barney Hill, as he's looking through the binoculars, says that he can very clearly see between about 8 and 11 humanoid individuals that are standing there in the windows, looking at him.
Hmm.
And he says that all of a sudden there's this burst of activity, and several of them go running back to like this control panel behind, in this what looks like a corridor, like surrounding a central main area within maybe a centrifuge kind of this, what he described as a large pancake that was kind of tilted downward facing him with this double row of windows. And they all run back into this craft except for one who remains and stares at him intently, right? And this individual, the way that Barney describes it, now this is an important point. Walter Webb, who is a NICAP investigator, conducted an interview with the Hills very shortly after this all happened, because when they got home, first they weren't going to tell anybody about it. But then Betty, whose sister had a sighting, Betty calls her sister, and her sister was entertaining the police chief from the nearby town, who overhears the conversation, and reportedly tells her, you should report this to Peace Air Force Base. So she does. And then there was a report actually taken, and that was sent to Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Field. But at that time, Betty didn't make any mention whatsoever of seeing occupants, which was kind of curious that was left out of the initial UFO report. But as the Hills would only maybe days later explain to Walter Webb when he gets to them and interviews them, I believe it's maybe November by the time he gets down there to interview them, Walter Webb essentially talks with him, and they have at this point said, well, we saw beings, Barney saw beings on board the craft. I didn't tell the folks at Peace Air Force Base because I was thinking that they were going to think that was too far out there, but Barney clearly saw them. So, again, shortly after the incident, well in advance of any hypnosis, and frankly, before Betty presumably had actually documented dreams that she would begin having about the incident, Walter Webb interviews the Hills, and Barney gives a pretty vivid description of the occupants. Now, of the leader that he said stood there watching at the window, he said, all the beings, from what he could tell, appear to be wearing like these black, shiny uniforms that reminded him of glossy leather. The others weren't wearing hats, but the leader had a hat that looked like a flight cap, kind of like what an Air Force officer would wear, and that when he turned his head, he could see that there was a bill on it, right? He said that this man stood there looking very intently at him from the window, and he could see this through the binoculars. He said at one point also one of the men in the background turned and looked over his shoulder, a guy who's kind of operating a lever, and he turns and he smiles and looks over his shoulder. What's really interesting is later during hypnosis, and again I want to emphasize, that account of seeing the occupants came shortly after the sighting and was, again, it first appeared in that initial report from 1961 by Walter Webb, right there in the final weeks of that year. So that the fact that Barney had observed occupants was on record that early on, and for years, Barney would continue to retell that story, even appearing on radio programs like what was his name? I think Harv. What was his name? Harv Martin. I'll have to remember his last name. Actually, I can pull it up here, but. He would appear on various programs. Harv Morgan's Contact Radio Show, October 5th, 1964. Barney appears on this program, and he tells, again, almost the identical story. But at one point, Harv asks him, so did these people on board this craft, did they essentially look human? And Barney says, well, yes. And he goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing, but that the beings, again, there's, I guess only so much you can see even through binoculars when you're looking at something that's about, 8 or 10 stories up. But he says, from my vantage point, I could clearly see they looked human and there was nothing grotesque about them, is what he said. Okay, so that's the description pre-hypnosis that Barney gives us. And even though they were seen at a distance, he says whoever was on board this craft, they didn't necessarily look anything but human. And in fact, they were wearing very human clothes. Now, during hypnosis, Barney says some really interesting things that included the leader looking like a Nazi. He says he looks like a German Nazi. And I never noticed this before. He's got like what looks like a black scarf around his neck that's draped over his shoulder. And then the individual that's working the lever that looks over his shoulder at him, he says, and I can see his face. He looks like a red-headed Irishman. Now, these are really interesting descriptions. And actually, I talked a little about this with Olav Phillips in recent days. And Olav's of the mind, look, those descriptions are too explicit. This obviously seems to be describing humans, and his contention would be that we're talking about like possibly actual Nazis. Now, for my own part, I don't know if they were actual Nazis, but it certainly does sound like they were human. And now, during the hypnosis, Barney, of course, famously just draws the leader, but he draws him with really big eyes and talks about how the leader's eyes followed him everywhere he went through the craft and seemed to control him, and he would always see the leader's eyes. um, he also later, after the recordings of the hypnosis sessions were played for Betty and Barney by Dr. Benjamin Simon of Boston, who conducted the hypnosis. When the recordings of those hypnosis sessions were played for the Hills, after I believe the second tape was listened to, Barney said that, he went home and he started to kind of analyze his experiences, and he said, I remembered now getting a real good look at three of the guys who were standing outside the room that I went into. And in this instance, post hypnosis, Barney says, I don't remember any hair. They had gray skin that almost looked metallic, and they had just like a little slit for a mouth. As he said, there was no proboscis. He said there was just couple of little slits for a nose.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was, again, the eyes, which were dark and, kind of large, but he said that they were wraparound, and that the way that they were wraparound really disturbed him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's much more like a classic description of an alien. But again, interestingly, after the initial encounter and Barney's recollection, without any aid from hypnosis, of seeing these occupants, which he described as being essentially human and nothing grotesque about them, we had Betty Hill, who described in her dreams, and she kept very vivid notes about her dreams from this era immediately after it was several days after the events, and over the course of about 5 nights. And she describes these guys as, again, looking essentially like humans, but they're all shorter. She said that they're about her height, about 5 feet tall. Barney was
Mm-hmm.
taller than all of them. They did have kind of grayish skin, she said, but they all had big noses, right? Like ridiculous, almost comically big noses.
Hmm.
But other than that, they all looked kind of human. And at one point, she said the one that she presumed as being the leader starts speaking to her in English, but she says he has an accent. He's speaking with an accent. And then at one point, she's saying, Bonnie, wake up. She's calling over her shoulder. And one of them
Mm-hmm.
says to her, Bonnie, is his name Barney? And she says they're talking to her in English. Sometimes it's bad English, and it's with an accent. Anyway.
And it's out loud. It's not telepathic.
Well, the interesting thing is that neither of the Hills seem to directly remember the individuals explicitly speaking out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Although in her dreams, and again, let's just keep this in mind, these were just dreams, Betty describes the leader speaking to her in whatever capacity he was able to speak, and she said that he had an accent and that his English was pretty good and she could understand it, and that he was friendly but businesslike. It was all professional,
Right.
Right this way, please. No harm will come to you. Please, right this way, kind of like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
But when she gets into the examination room, she says another man comes in, not the leader, and that his English was not as good as the other guys. Now, I'm no expert on telepathy. I'm just saying that, this was all a dream, and we should really take that for what it is. But she described, again, varying degrees of mastery of the English language. Would that apply if it was telepathic communication? I don't know. In her hypnosis sessions, she described the occupants as looking a little different, but essentially all the same details from her dream are still in the hypnosis. But when Simon continues to press her, what do they look like? Do they look like normal humans? She says no. He says, why not? And she says, I'm not sure. I can't tell. She just says they don't look like normal humans. Barney, again, is a lot more explicit in his description, especially with the eyes. So what do you make of all that? Again, it had been the opinion of Simon. It had been the opinion of NICAP, not Walter Webb, but NICAP on the whole. They all said, look, the sighting of the UFO was a pretty good UFO sighting, but with all this stuff about them being taken on board, this all sounds like a fantasy, and this all probably stemmed from those dreams.
Yeah,
And
because back then you didn't really have a whole lot of any type of contact experience.
no, you didn't.
Reported.
You had the case, and it wasn't public knowledge at the time, I don't believe, but Antonio Villaboas
Mm-hmm.
in Brazil, and that actually had already come to the attention of Jim and Coral Lorenzen with APRO. They didn't know about that case, but they didn't publicize it because they were very. And if you go back and read the old APRO journals from that era, by the way, the old APRO journals also make no mention of the Hill abduction. APRO wasn't touching claims of abduction. NICAP, as an organization, didn't endorse the abduction claims. Blue Book got a report, but the Blue Book report didn't even mention Barney seeing the humanoids. But Walter Webb, the original NICAP investigator who interviewed the Hills, literally within a few weeks of their sighting, he did get Barney on the record talking about seeing those individuals. Now, again, to me, the details of the abduction are so well detailed that, it's hard for me to imagine that something didn't happen. But again, Dr. Benjamin Simon later on, as was revealed in correspondences with Philip Klass that Robert Schaefer has archived at his website. It's obvious Dr. Simon was much more skeptical, and the more
Mm-hmm.
Betty Hill became famous in the years after the encounter, keep in mind Barney died in 1969 of a stroke. She goes on to continue to kind of become a contactee. There were people who claimed that Betty was still in contact with him, and they would hold these night watches. Jacques Vallée went out to one or two of those
Mm-hmm.
and said it was evident that even if she had actually been abducted, she couldn't distinguish a street light from a landed UFO. And it's true. I mean, Vallée said everything she'd see was like a UFO, and then she ended up giving a talk years later, showing some pictures of things that she had taken that she thought were UFOs, and basically everybody wanted to hear Betty Hill. And by the time the talk was over, she ran so far over on the length of her talk that they were like jeering her off the stage
Mm-hmm.
because the photos were so bad. She wrote a book a few years later, I think, called like A Common Sense to UFOs or something to that effect. And again, those who read it said, it was unfortunately full of fantasies and full of stories, very outlandish stories, about her belief that she'd been contacted. But again, it all comes back to Vallée saying, again, if I had met a landed UFO on a dark country road and little men had taken me on board and examined me, I might also think I was seeing UFOs all the time.
Yeah, and another thing that people need to keep in mind is, if you're a fan of the horror genre, all you've got to do is listen to the tapes of Barney's um, hypnotic regression session where he sees, these creatures, and man, he is just yelling and screaming to get out of there, and it's looking at me, and I mean, that they're just horrific.
It's it's evident that Barney was emotionally disturbed. And the thing that actually disturbs him the most, he's really losing it, not so much like during the examination. During the examination, it seems evident that his waking memory was either intentionally suppressed or it had been a post-hypnotic kind of suggestion, assuming that there was an actual abduction, if that happened. And again, I'm very on the fence about it myself, not to be a complete skeptic. Again, as I was saying, the details of the abduction scenario are so detailed that it's hard to imagine that something didn't happen, but it is also possible that Betty Hill was an extraordinarily gifted storyteller, may have believed that something had happened to her as well, but it could have all stemmed from dreams that she had. And that was Dr. Simon's belief that, Betty had had these dreams. Betty had talked to Barney about these dreams. They go into the hypnosis session. Betty recounts almost verbatim what she remembered in the dreams.
But then
Barney,
that wouldn't explain, the magnetization of the boot of their car, and
right,
all these other the scrapes and scratches on his shoes, that kind of stuff. The
which
missing
are
time.
which are points that Betty, Barney, of course, made, but also in their defense, Walter Webb, the NICAP interviewer, who, in his minority opinion, apparently because NICAP didn't endorse the case at the time, but Webb certainly did, and said, I think that, as he put it, he said, I will allow the possibility that Dr. Simon's right, that it was just this mutually shared sort of aberration. But in my opinion, he said, it's far less likely considering the similarity of the Hill case to other abductions, and in his report that he did, which I think was written in the first one was 1961, but he did an updated version of it several years later. And he notes several similar close encounter cases and even instances where people were taken on board craft. And he says, again, Benjamin Simon wasn't aware of all this information. Now, anyway, not to do a whole show about Betty and Barney Hill, the only point really in bringing all this up and being so specific in the details as I'm trying to be is if we look at what Barney Hill described before he underwent hypnosis, before he would have had significant exposure to Betty's recollections from her dreams, the account he gives Walter Webb in that earliest report seems to describe people aboard that craft, which he later again told Harv Morgan and again in other interviews that he had given. Yeah, they basically looked just like people. There was nothing grotesque about them. And it's a difficult thing to kind of say which was the correct description. Some would say, well, of course, he thought they were people until he underwent hypnosis, and then they look like aliens. But then again, the more skeptically inclined might say, well, of course, they look like people until they underwent hypnosis, and then they look like aliens. You see
Yeah,
what
but
I'm
it's
saying?
not like Dr. Simon, planted the very first gray alien in their memories. Like I said, when
Right.
you're hearing Barney's hypnosis tape, it's blood curdling.
It is blood curdling, but again, I'll just point to the earliest description he gives of watching the man from standing in the field while looking through binoculars. And he says he looks like a German Nazi. And then the other guy who turned around and he sees him smile over his shoulder, he says, and he looks like a red-headed Irishman.
Right,
Now,
but was the spell being cast before they were brought aboard or after?
it's a good question. Now I'll just point to it, and this is a tangent, but an anecdote maybe worthy of mentioning. You look at some of the late Michael Persinger, I guess, his research with regard to the God helmet and everything.
Yeah,
There were some interesting effects that were achieved with the inducing, uh, for lack of a better term, delusions or hallucinatory experiences by, putting the cerebral cortex, I guess it's the cerebral cortex is the portion that is being exposed in those experiments to uh, high yield electromagnetic fields for a short period, and it will sometimes induce visual distortions, auditory hallucinations.
religious experiences. Yeah,
Well, yeah, and again, hence the reason that they nicknamed this the God helmet. But I seem to recall that in similar experiments that some people in medical environments where people were around them, possibly even in remembrance of their birth experiences, according to some, or at very least past medical experiences that they've had, people. And this may have aired on like a program like Sightings back in the 1990s, but they have people laying around and they say, "What do you see?" And they're like, "I see people." And these are people, by the way, who presumably had never had any kind of an alien abduction. They're remembering an actual experience with doctors in a medical environment. But the way that they describe it through the lens of that altered state of consciousness as a result of close proximity, for instance, to an electromagnetic field, they describe it like this. They say, "I see people," and they have big heads and they're gray. They look kind of gray. And so the argument that they were trying to make is that it's possible maybe for a person remembering a very non-alien abduction type experience to perceive seeing humans and describe those people as being similar to how, again, popular descriptions of aliens are represented. Now, I'm not trying to debunk the Barney and Betty Hill story, but I'm just trying to emphasize something that to me is abundantly clear if you actually review the case, but that a lot of books and a lot more TV shows and articles and podcasts and things over the years have failed to do. And that is, there's a lot of emphasis on the alien appearance of these occupants, and there's a lot less said about how, especially in Barney's waking memory, how human they looked.
right.
And that's not necessarily to say, and therefore, this is evidence of a breakaway civilization. But again, if I had to guess what the likeliest explanation is for what they saw, um, I don't buy the idea that there was no object and that this was ball lightning. I think at one point that Philip J. Klass may have even tried to argue it was ball lightning, and that's just so silly to me. It just gets really, that's like a dereliction of skepticism in my view.
I
But
remember that Philip J. Klass had said something about, well, they had just seen this drive-in movie that night that was, the one with Peter Graves and the big bug-eyed guys.
I don't know. I mean, Martin Kottmeyer did point out that just a few days before Barney's hypnosis session, where
Oh,
he
it was that Outer Limits episode, right?
well, yeah, and that was a few days before the hypnosis session. It was like
Mm-hmm.
literally 4 or 5 days before Barney's session, where he draws the big-eyed leader. And actually, interestingly, maybe Kottmeyer had a point, because again, in his waking memory, Barney described him as being essentially human in appearance, but again, seen from a good distance through binoculars, right? But I mean, he described, even under hypnosis, essentially that first viewing. It's only his recollections thereafter, especially when he gets on board the craft, that these more distorted kind of views of the individuals begin to appear. But again, compare that with Betty Hill's descriptions, where she's, Benjamin Simon at one point is asking her, what do they look like? Do they look like normal Americans? No, they don't. And why don't they? I don't know. What's different? She says, I can't tell. You know, neither of them seemed actually as able to describe what they saw accurately as Betty had been in her dreams or Barney had been in his waking memory. And so, again, and I'm not the only UFO researcher who's pointed out that there are a lot of problems with hypnosis. Now, what we
Oh,
might
sure.
imagine, right? And if anything, adding the hypnosis layer into all of this may have further complicated the case. Even Benjamin Simon had said it seems likely that those memories that they had repressed would probably have come out later anyway. But in Betty's case, again, if those dreams were not merely dreams, they had already come out in the form of dreams. And in Barney's case, although he claimed that he didn't remember anything, Simon was convinced that, he didn't want to remember something, but that those memories probably would have surfaced for Barney eventually too, as they often do for various patients that Simon had dealt with. But again, so our speculation here could be this, that if indeed we take the earliest, which I would say based on the proximity to the actual sighting, we take the earliest, most recent account following the incident that was provided to a NICAP investigator where Barney did actually describe seeing those occupants. That account remained remarkably consistent in the way that he retold it over the years, even after the hypnosis, and it does seem to describe humans. And one could interpret sightings like that as being novel, not for being the world's first alien abduction, but novel in the sense that it's a UFO encounter of an extraordinary nature, where the occupants that were described at times were described as being very human-like. One final little thing I'll offer, and this is kind of interesting. Barney at one point, and this is actually in John G. Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, he talks about how in the same breath as he's describing his later analysis and remembering no hair and kind of grayish skin, he says that he and Betty had visited, or rather had gone to a lecture by the anthropology professor Carlton Kuhn, right? And that Carlton Kuhn at one point had shown images of people who are the indigenous residents around the Strait of Magellan.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I've looked this up. I think that the name for folks in that area would be Alakaluf Fegians, maybe is the pronunciation. It's a bit esoteric.
I'll take your word for it, Micah.
Right. But again, Barney said when Dr. Kuhn showed an image of these individuals, he said that was almost exactly what these people that I saw on board that craft looked like. This almost upturned nose, this mouth that was a little different from like mine or Betty's, dark eyes, fairly large. And he says that what it was, and this is important too, he says, rather than being like a huge eye, he says those people in the photographs had this layer of fat, right? As a result of how they had adapted to live in their climate. He says, not like an Oriental eye per se, using his parlance of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, so in other words, it gave the appearance of a really big eye when in fact it was actually the structure of the eye, not the actual eye itself or the iris.
Mm-hmm.
But he says those people in that photograph that Dr. Kuhn showed, that's almost like exactly what these people look like. So if we pull up an image on Wikipedia, and you can actually do this, of the Alakaluf Fegian.
Yeah, you can share your screen if you want.
If I'm able to do that, I could certainly pull up an image.
At the bottom of it says share.
This could be interesting. Let's try this. Okay, let me share for just a moment here. I'll try to share the screen here. Let's see if we can work this out here. Best way, I'll try to figure out if I can.
And if you run a dual display, make sure to turn all your porn tabs off on the other one.
Fortunately for me, I'm a prude and I have none. So let me see here. Let's try this though. Although I bet you that's probably happened. Oh, I can. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if I can do a window or a Chrome tab. So let's see. Yeah, I'm going to just share that tab here if I can find the right one. I believe this is the one we want. So let me share this now.
Yep.
Okay, is that coming through?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Whoops, we said no porn, and in fact, actually, it appears that the mother there may be bare-chested. But ladies and gentlemen, this is anthropology. Get your minds out of the gutter. So this is an example of the Alakaluf Fegians dressed in Huanaco skins circa 1882. Gil, if I zero in, though, on their faces, does that zoom as well?
Yeah.
For you guys? Mm-hmm. It does? Okay. So let's look at the faces. This, okay, is probably a good representation of essentially how Barney Hill said that the appearance of the faces of the beings on board that craft looked to him.
I can see how they do have sort of an extra layer of fat, but they don't look inhuman.
Not at all. But again, Barney, as he described it, was like somewhere between, he said his description had been, for instance, they didn't look Chinese to me, but that they had dark eyes, Again, in various descriptions that Betty gave, she'd said dark eyes, dark hair. She said large noses. In Barney's description, he said they seem to have almost no, a very, very under-pronounced nose, a mouth almost more like a slit. Now, again, this description doesn't seem entirely, look at the child here, by the way, with the dark eyes and what have you. This doesn't look entirely consistent with Barney's description. But I find it interesting that this, as far as people, whoops, let me see if I can bring that back. As far as people that he had seen images of, I think I've stopped sharing now and should be back.
Yeah.
That's what he said based on the exposure to that image he had had. That wasn't the exact same image, mind you. This was my effort to try and find something similar to what he described. We'll probably never know what the image that Carlton Kuhn showed in this lecture, but that was essentially what Barney had described. So I find that interesting. Take that for what it is. Again, that's all entirely speculation. At the end of the day, where my bias falls as far as that case goes is I do think that the Hills probably saw a craft. I do think that Barney's description of having seen the craft and the occupants is not only consistent with the shape, the dynamics, the appearance, and other aspects of UFO cases over the years, including sightings of the occupants. But I also think, and just to give you another example of one, I'll pull one up here in a moment, but I think that it's important to keep all this in mind in terms of that possibility that we've discussed in the past of like a breakaway civilization. Again, some sort of an earthly component that could explain some of these cases. But now, if you recall, Betty and Barney Hill both describing seeing a hat of some sort, right, on this on all the occupants. In fact, during her dream sequence, Betty said that when they came out of the craft that they'd all put on like jackets. Presumably, it could have been very cold at around midnight on a September evening in New Hampshire.
Sure.
But she said that they were all wearing hats that reminded her of like Air Force hats. Listen to this account, and this is a pretty well-known one right here from 1966 at Temple, Oklahoma. William Laxton observes a large landed fish-shaped aircraft in the road with a man outside it conducting inspections or repairs. Laxton said the aircraft had a plastic bubble in front, a meter in diameter, and that he could see light through it, bearing similarity to the cockpit of a B-26. He saw a kind of stabilizer tail at the back with numbers and letters painted on a dark circular window. Laxton thought it was the initials TL and the number 47 or 41 and 68, as you would expect on a flying saucer. But he also goes on to say beneath the aircraft was a man with a flashlight conducting repairs. Now listen to this right here. Laxton estimated his height at 1.5 meters, his age 30 to 35 years. He wore a two-piece suit like a green military uniform with a baseball cap. He thought it had 3 bands above and 3 bands below on the sleeve, like the stripes on a sergeant major. The bands were in a bow, and below the lines were in a more broadly V shape. The man, upon seeing Laxton, entered the craft, which produced a noise like a drill running at high speed as it rose from the ground to about 15 feet, then flew quickly away, leaving static electricity in the air. Which Laxton said the hair on the back of my neck stood on end and on my hands. And I would have to say, if I'd seen that, that probably would have happened to me too. But again, the description of the uniform in that case is what interests me because it's actually quite similar to the description that Betty gave and also in some regards that Barney gave of the occupants that they saw. So, I mean, again, make of that what you will, but
yeah.
I find those things very interesting.
And then, we get into the parts of the case that I think are probably better known, like Betty's description of the star map and Marjorie Fish's eventual discovery of the Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticulum system. And, when these things are researched and found to be correct later, I think that adds a lot to the story.
Well, it does, but the problem with the Marjorie Fish map is that later in life, according to her obituary, and there are probably other sources for this too, but she reportedly, based on further analysis of the data, said that she refuted that hypothesis. Now, the main thing that caused her to refute the idea of the star map was that the star systems that she thought initially would have been host to life were binary stars that were too close together to have facilitated life forms, i.e. a planet in orbit around them. But yes, again, Marjorie was a brilliant person. And again, I think that I think she should be a shining example of a good researcher because here you had an elementary school teacher an amateur astronomer. She was actually an amateur in a lot of different fields of science. She loved geology. She loved archaeology. She loved all kinds of stuff. And she was a member of Mensa. Okay, so ladies and gents, we essentially had a genius, of sorts on our hands here. And she, instead of going, aha, well, I'm so smart that I can immediately rule out the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation and think that this is a nonsensical story. No, Marjorie says, okay, well, if Betty was shown some kind of a map by the occupants, and then during the hypnosis, Dr. Benjamin Simon asked her to draw this map. Well, she thought to herself, let's try, let's see if we can construct a model of the universe and find a pattern that matches the location of the stars she was shown on the map. And how Marjorie did this, by the way, was she took beads, which she hung from dangling threads to approximate the estimated distances based, I believe, on the Gliese catalog, so that she could orient the location of the stars based on the estimated distances that astronomers had judged by that time. And I believe in 1968, she first noticed a pattern that seemed to be a good match for the map that Betty had drawn based on what she had seen on board the craft. And then she updated that with information in the 1969 edition of the Gliese catalog and put forward her hypothesis. But it was immediately refuted, of course, by other scientists, notably Carl Sagan. But here I would say this. If you are a elementary school teacher and member of Mensa, that achievement alone is pretty cool. But that you have put forward a hypothesis, and even if it's being challenged by the biggest scientific names in the world at the time, if Carl Sagan is doing a segment on Cosmos about your claim, you still won. Okay, you did a good job. And then later, based on additional information that seemed to show inconsistencies in that data, she said, okay, as a good skeptic, I can no longer endorse my own hypothesis. Hey, that's something I wish a lot of skeptics would do.
That's the process of science.
Yes, it is. And she was a good scientist in my view. She heard something. She had a question. She developed an idea for an experiment with it, and she decided to try to build an experiment around that, and formed a hypothesis that this is a good location based on the data I've looked at where we might be able to find life. And then she spots this correlation, and then she tries to update it, which we might kind of liken to, repeating the experiment. She kind of updated it and refined it over time, but then eventually had to refute the hypothesis. And again, this is an important part of the scientific process, the test for falsehood.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it seems that
falsifiability.
And Marjorie knew that, and so once her theory had been resolutely falsified and she could no longer endorse it, she didn't hold on to the sacred cow. I guess they had steak for dinner, but but I find that a very respectable thing for a person of scientific proponent to do.
Sure. While we still have a little time, did you have any updates on the Skinwalker Ranch area that you wanted to go over?
I mean, I don't have any real updates about that. I mean, Chrissy Newton and I had traveled to the gate of Skinwalker Ranch back in late May. We actually, it was kind of quite an adventure because we'd spent spent several days working out there in the Uinta Basin.
Mm-hmm.
We interviewed a few UFO witnesses. We spent some time up on an adjacent ranch property called Blind Frog Ranch. Geologically, I think I found that the most interesting. That was the most interesting thing, but there were also archaeological aspects of the property that were really interesting too. As far as Skinwalker Ranch goes, though, I mean, gosh, people put so much emphasis on that property. And my biggest takeaway from Chrissy and I driving out there to it, and then we actually rented this camper van and everything and actually camped. There's a famous campground, right? That's right behind Skinwalker Ranch. And initially we had a small film crew that was coming with us. Then one of the guys, actually, I guess I can say this. If you're familiar with the Aerial School Phenomenon documentary by the very talented filmmaker Randall Nickerson, he was
the Ariel School, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ariel School, yes. Randall Nickerson was supposed to join us, and he couldn't come. Our other cameraman was unable to attend either at the last minute, and so here it was, and it's just like, it's Chrissy and I, and we're like, well, we're just going to go on out there and try this. And so we drove out to Skinwalker Ranch, and we knew that there was a campground nearby. Mm-hmm. And this is pretty famous. So we went to that campground, and it was closed because the owners had some sort of an emergency. And so we're like, well, what are we going to do now? So then we find another nearby campground overlooking the reservoir, which is really still overlooking the main property of Skinwalker. But so we went there. We had our night vision gear and everything, and we, stayed up fairly late and observed. Unfortunately, didn't see anything incredible, but we had a lot of time on our hands to talk about Skinwalker Ranch. And I'll tell you this: the biggest takeaway I think I have is that I can't imagine why UFOs or any of the other phenomena that allegedly happens out there. I can't imagine why they would obey property boundaries, and things like that, and only operate within Skinwalker Ranch.
As though, however, other UFO cases seem to agree that that they've followed state boundaries, national boundaries, even down to county boundaries.
Kuehl made that claim, back in Operation Trojan Horse. He had said that he had made that action, and this is interesting because actually in the furtherance of what we were talking about earlier, in terms of there possibly being something other than an extraterrestrial component, Kuehl's whole argument had been, if these things are ET visiting in spacecraft, why do they pay attention to, country borders, property borders, like the lines between states? That's exactly the argument he made. And he says, aliens wouldn't know about those borders and sure as hell wouldn't pay attention to them. Right. He says if UFOs are observed operating in that capacity, then we need to consider that this is some sort of an earthly phenomenon, not something necessarily from elsewhere. Fair point. And I have that similar take that I come away with. But again, really more broadly, I would just say after all the folks that Chrissy and I interviewed, one man in particular who actually showed us, some interesting footage. I don't know if it was particularly compelling, but it was some footage of this orb kind of hovering over an adjacent mountain. I came away thinking that the Uinta Basin certainly has some interesting phenomena. And so beyond that, I will simply I will refer the listeners, the viewers, to the Debrief's YouTube channel and check out Chrissy's podcast, which is a video show just like this called Rebelliously Curious. A couple of episodes that are going to be really interesting for folks are going to, well, one in particular actually is the interview she did with George Knapp and Colm Kelleher. Chrissy asks them about a very interesting document from
who are, of course, the authors of The Hunt for the Skinwalker.
Well, they're the authors of The Hunt for the Skinwalker and also co-authors with James Lukatsky of this new book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, right. Which, despite the cover art, is an interesting. I would consider it an interesting historical document in terms of helping establish the ALSAT program and the story behind it, and the difference between that and the ATIP program, which has been very confusing since 2017. But Chrissy asked them some very interesting questions, and it's a very unique interview. And both George and Colm seem to express as much to her after the interview, and I would agree. So folks definitely might want to go check out that interview, which at the very beginning, she actually shows a couple of the photographs from our trip together out there in Utah. But another thing,
if you'll put the URL to that in the private chat, Micah, I'll move it into the regular chat. That's something that we should definitely let everybody get a look at.
I'll see if I can get that without playing a bunch of annoying music and things in the background. Which happens sometimes, but yeah, I think I can get that for us really quickly here. If I can do a quick search.
And Jill has informed me that we have 5 minutes left to enter the giveaway for an autographed copy of Micah's book, The Ghost Rockets. So if you're interested in being eligible to win that, do follow the URL.
Hi, welcome to the future.
Oh, God, I hate that thing. God, we've got to change that on our YouTube channel. There's this terrible music that always plays. So,
don't get me a copyright strike, Micah.
No, you won't get that. But I got to get that off of our YouTube channel anyway. Okay, I've got the link though that I'm going to put in the private chat here, and then you can put it in our main chat. So that's coming at you right now. That is a link to the episode of Rebelliously Curious in question. George Knapp,
just to the YouTube channel that the debrief has. That would also be nice to be able to put in there.
Well, yeah, I can give you that really quickly. And that is simple, actually. If you just go on YouTube and search for the Debrief Media, the URL would actually be youtube.com/c/the Debrief Media, but I'll put that link in the chat here for you as well.
So people could just search on the Debrief Media.
Yeah, that is. But I've just put that link in the private chat for you, so you
Okay.
should have that as well.
Yeah, I've got it.
Cool.
High technology, folks. High technology.
Well, indeed, living in real time. And then last thing I'll point out too, again, another one of our fine ladies of ufology who is out there doing incredible work. Christina Gomez, my wonderful colleague, formerly with the debrief as well, but now is independent, still very much a friend of the family, so to speak. And of course, someone I keep in touch with. In fact, I think I'm going to be doing her news show with her this Friday. But Christina just interviewed Brandon Fugel and
Ah, of course, the owner of the ranch.
gave us quite an update on what's happening out there at Skinwalker. So definitely check out her fine work. Her programs, of course, can be found. Just search for Christina Gomez, but Shifting the Paradigm. She's actually got a few shows, Mysteries with a History, and a few of these other things. But again, she just recently spoke with Brandon Fugel. So you might check out both Christina and Chrissy's shows for the latest. Those will give you a very good up-to-date perspective on what's going on with Skinwalker Ranch. More than I can tell you.
I think I may have been conflating those two names up until you just mentioned that.
Well, it's a little confusing because we had Christina, who, and of course she's still very much a friend of the debrief. Chrissy, of course, is very much still with us. But we've also got Chris. So we had Christina, Chrissy, Chris.
That makes it easy.
Yeah.
And Darius Munchausen says that he's subscribed to Christina Gomez.
Indeed. Well, I'm one of her Patreon supporters as well because I really support her work and also, I appreciate not only her work but also her friendship. She's a wonderful person who will call just to check in. I think that the older I get, the fewer friends I have that just call just to say, "Hey, how are you? How you doing?" And she's one of them. So she and Chrissy both are just wonderful people. In addition to the wonderful work that they do for the community. So I appreciate them on all fronts.
As we're kind of winding down here, we've already sort of spoken about the possibility of antediluvian civilizations or lost cities. A, do you have anything to add to that? And B, is there anything on the unidentified submersible objects angle that you would want to tackle?
Well, again, what's interesting is down there in Brazil, during the so-called, I guess what the Brazilian Air Force called it was Operação Prato, Operation Saucer or Plate. And this was during the 1970s in response to all the sightings there around Colares, Brazil. A lot of the time they said that these objects would come up out of the water, right? Mm-hmm. And, again, that's a good distance geographically from Chiloé Island, off the coast of Chile. But nonetheless, I'm interested in how close we have all of these, UFO sightings to water or to islands, often just coming right up out of the oceans. As far as updates about that, I don't know if there are many, apart from the fact that we have currently in recent days seen new legislation which calls for updated, reporting procedures and more importantly, transparency efforts related to UAP. I believe that there was an accompaniment to recent legislation that was published by the Senate Intelligence Select Committee. And let me just read from a little of this, which is Senate Report 117-132, Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023. And if I do a quick search, Section 703, modification of requirement for the office to address unidentified aerospace, and listen to this, undersea phenomena. That's right. They say Section 703 renames the office established to carry out the duties of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force and clarifies the office's legal authorities, duties, and leadership to incorporate intelligence community equities that are integral to ensuring full oversight of unidentified aerospace and undersea phenomena subject matters. Now, really going no further than that, one of the most important points here is that throughout this document, and this as proposed language, or this, I guess, actually more like an explanation report, an explanatory report following possible drafted language for inclusion with the National Defense Authorization Act for next year. Again, for those who don't follow all this like I do, that's the biggest defense spending bill, which essentially defines what the budget and what the agenda will be for the DoD in the year ahead, overseeing, essentially all military operations.
Mm-hmm. And presumably Black Ops, the black budget projects wouldn't necessarily fall under that, right?
Correct. Although, again, some of the wording that they've called for with relation to UAP specifically is moving toward trying to encourage people. It's offering protections for people if they come out and they do speak publicly about having knowledge of special access programs and things related to UAP. In essence,
like as whistleblower status.
right. And so, in essence, what they're trying to do is they seem to be, I guess if I were to word this carefully, they're trying to offer protections for people as though to encourage more people who have worked in government with related to secret UFO programs to come forward and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to lessen the restrictions that if there's a secret, that have kept it secret within government. But again, that's based in part on speculation that there is some secret component within government that knows more than the civilian, populace does.
Right.
And that frankly lawmakers and that basically, the military knows. Is there something that's been kept so compartmentalized and so secret that it's actually just remained off the books? I mean, maybe that's possible as that extremely loud motorcycle drives by, but I don't know if you guys can hear that at home, but I've got one of those people in my neighborhood with one of those kind of motorcycles,
Yeah,
so.
I've got one of those type of people in my neighborhood without one of those type of mufflers on his big SUV truck.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, this is one of those individuals that every time he gets any kind of vehicle, he removes that muffler just so he can make it noisy.
Yep. Just to spoil my show.
See, and this is the thing. The UFOs, how have they remained so secretive? How have they remained so hidden? They don't use mufflers. They don't create sonic booms. They're silent.
Yeah.
That goes
And
a long
BK
way.
Dan in the chat has a point here with the USO contact 1492 with Columbus.
Yeah, we can talk about that. So Columbus, 1492, before he makes landfall at Guanajuato, he says that he sees, and this was described in his journals, and there'd been, I think, Pedro Gutierrez and someone else there aboard the ship had said that they'd seen this as well, but they said that they saw a little light going up and down, and Columbus likened it to, he said, like the bobbing up and down of a little wax candle. Now, in my opinion, that's probably exactly what it was. This was probably one of the native Taino on one of the nearby islands carrying a torch of some kind. It's possible that there was some sort of bioluminescent phenomena that was observed at that time. It's possible that it was something else. I wonder, honestly, why that sighting is innocuous as the little sighting of light that Columbus made. I mean, it's in his journal. He no question about it that he saw some sort of little light that was moving up and down. But why?
It wasn't big enough or spectacular enough for him to just go gaga over it, right?
Like he didn't see some sort of strange light moving under the ocean. He didn't see something come up out of the water. He didn't see something flying through the air. He just saw something in the distance. And you got to keep in mind that this was, according to his journals, pretty close to him in the early morning hours making landfall at Guanajuato, whatever that was. It's still disputed exactly what the landing location actually would have been.
But it could have been a bonfire or who knows.
And that's exactly, I think, what, again, in Columbus's own description, he said like a little wax candle going up and down. I mean, that sounds an awful lot like somebody probably carrying a torch to me.
Or it might have been their ship going up and down and a bonfire on the shore.
Well, it's very possible that was what was going on because, again, if he was starting to hit wave interference coming from the shoreline and everything, and it's causing the ship to go up and down a little more, but they weren't sure how close they were to land at that point and therefore didn't expect there to be a land mass nearby that they were able to see light on. Yeah, it could have been a visual effect, that they observed in the middle of the night while they're out there at sea. That, again, probably would have created just the kind of visual conditions for, visual distortions, let's say, especially if you aren't expecting to see lights at that hour. So.
Yeah, and after all, he was expecting India anyway, so.
Right.
All right, let's go ahead and bring on a mod, and then we'll spin the wheel and do our giveaway for this week. And I'll just go ahead and get it out front that this is the part of the broadcast that I find the most trepidatious for me, because whenever I see my head spinning around like that, it makes me a little seasick. But calling mods, come on in and bring us your wheel of what's the word? Prestidigitation.
Yes, prestidigitation, yeah.
And here's Canadian Spider-Man.
Well, hello, Canadian Spider-Man.
Hi.
Greetings.
Hi, Cardinal Sin. Hi, Micah.
Good to see you.
Thanks for
You have
joining us again.
a very fetching Masters of the Genre shirt on.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. That's a very Canadian backdrop too, with the firewood. Yeah.
I chopped all this myself. Yeah, sure.
Just today.
You gotta do it in the spring so it's ready for the winter. Of course, you know that. But yeah.
Oh, I do indeed. Yes.
Yep. There you go. May I show the back, Cardinal Sin? Not
Absolutely, of course.
Yeah. All right. So this is fantastic. I just made a video for you. This is a winner. This is fantastic.
And it's got the URL on the back.
Perfect.
Nice.
Yeah. And am I correct in saying this was Fet for Hire?
No, actually, that one is Douglas Nelson.
Douglas Nelson. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, next time I talk to him, I'll have to compliment him. So I believe Jill, I can't take credit for the wheel. Let's give that to Jill. Antiderivative Jill has the wheel right here. So
all right.
I can bring that up and I will share that with you.
And we do thank all of our wonderful mods for their service and attention, and they're just the best mods on YouTube.
Indeed.
Okay.
I happen to get that lucky, Micah.
I don't know how you do it. You always do, though.
There we go.
Sharing that with you.
There's that sucker.
Yeah, and the audio is on as well.
Okay.
And I'll turn that up on my end.
Mexican Iron Man's in the audience, huh?
Oh, hey, Mike. He's great. He's always good to have in the audience.
Oh, yeah.
He brings...
I just didn't see him because I was so enthralled with the subject matter.
Yeah. He brings an entourage with him usually, too. So.
Yes. Always welcome. Always welcome.
Mm-hmm. Any of the Midnight's Edge crew. Absolutely. Okay. On your command, sir.
So mote it be.
Nice.
Yes.
Phantom Boomer.
Yeah, Phantom Boomer.
Congratulations.
That's awesome. Congratulations, Phantom Boomer.
Who I believe
Nicely
said previously that he already had a copy of this book, but now I guess he'll have another one.
Well, I could certainly replace it with a different book he hasn't got. Yeah, I'll tell you what. Just tell Phantom Boomer to get in touch with you and let him know if there's a book of mine he doesn't have, and I'll send one of those.
Why don't we send Phantom Boomer the mind,
Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule?
Yeah, that's it. I can't get a single word out today.
That's quite all right. I have those days as well. Yeah, Phantom Boomer, if you don't have that book, that will be on the way to you here shortly. I was a little late getting the last prize out, unfortunately, because of my ridiculous travel schedule. I've been, in recent days, where? North Carolina, California, back to North Carolina, Cape Girardeau, back to North Carolina. Who knows where I'm probably going to go back to California at some point, too, real soon. So anyway, I'll make sure that I get these books out in the mail before the next trip. But the last one, unfortunately, got a little backlog. So apologies about that, Steve. It's on the way, though. Or you may already have it, actually, in fact. So, you know, if he's saying, what is he talking about? It's on the way. I've got the thing. But if you haven't, it is on the way, so don't worry.
And
thank you.
Thank you, Canadian Spider-Man.
Thank you again, Canadian Spider-Man.
I'll step off.
Your service.
Yeah, it's always good to be on with you, Micah. Absolutely.
Always good to see you too, my friend. Indeed.
And thank you, Cardinal Sin, for assembling such a great wrench team.
And thanks for helping us out, as always.
Oh, you're welcome, sir. I'm going to go wear this around the neighborhood right now, and when people ask, who's this dude?
You just show them the back.
Still just show them the back.
That's right.
That's right.
Who's this Cardinal Sin guy, anyway?
Well, come and watch Masters of the Genre, and you'll find out.
That's right.
All right. See you later.
Take care.
So, again, Micah, I do want to thank you, brother, for coming on the show and sharing this bounty of information with us. and can't wait to have you on soon enough again.
Oh, it's always my pleasure too, man. I always enjoy our conversations, and as you can tell, there's always plenty rattling around in this old thinker right here. I'm happy to share that with you and your audience, and of course to share some quality time with all you guys. So thank you, Gil, for having me here. Dear Cardinal, it is always my honor, privilege, and pleasure.
And mine, and mine. And with that, I will say it is Cardinal Sin out.